Well, I've been assigned the topic, I guess, tonight of finding a link between Saddam Hussein and Janet Jackson's Super Bowl performance. So I guess I'll do my best to try that. But actually, I think that's probably as plausible as the link between Saddam Hussein and 9/11. So I have to say that I think that's really what we need to ask ourselves is, did Saddam Hussein have an operational link to the attacks on 9/11, not just with Al-Qaeda, but with 9/11. And the reason I say that is many people have meetings, many organizations have meetings with other organizations, and many people have meetings and many contacts. In fact, do we call Don Rumsfeld a terrorist because he met with Saddam Hussein just after Saddam gassed the Kurds? I believe it was in 1984. So, you know, we have to be careful about these things. And I think the mainstream view is that in the CIA and the State Department and everywhere else is that there's no significant contacts between Al-Qaeda and bin Laden. And even less, of course, between Saddam, not Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, Al-Qaeda and Saddam. And I think there's even less of a connection between Saddam and the 9/11 attacks. And we also have to ask ourselves that even if there are, even if we prove this or had a deep suspicion of it, you know, we launch a lot of attacks and things out of vengeance many times. You know, we want a visceral reaction to 9/11. All of us had that. It was a terrible thing, and it was a you know, despicable attack on innocent civilians, which is terror, which is the definition of terrorism. But I think we have to ask ourselves, if we really want to be smart about these things, what we should do if we did find a link. Should we have invaded? I think it would have been smarter to assess whether we would have made things worse or not, rather than just say, man, we got to take out Saddam. So I think even in the worst case, we need to assess what we should have done, and I would have had the CIA or the Special Forces do some nasty covert things to Saddam, because I think we've done this with bin Laden, we've done it with Saddam Hussein, we did it with Milosevic. Our politicians like to build up people that they can punch for electoral purposes, and I think the real way to fight terrorism is quietly, through intelligence, special operations, law enforcement, and you get much more cooperation from countries than you do when you make things worse. And in my view, the invading Iraq was much like if Roosevelt would have responded to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the German declaration of war by attacking the Dutch. I mean, you're making things worse, and it's probably even worse than that because we've inflamed the Middle East and made things worse. I think it's very clear that on 61 different occasions, Cheney and other senior administration's officials, including the president, made this implicit link between Al-Qaeda and Saddam. And I think the evidence didn't show that. We may need to explore some of these meetings and go back. But I think we have to ask ourselves why this question is being asked a year and a half after the war. And I think the real answer is that we went to war and we're not sure why. That's just like in Iraq, we're fighting people, but we're not sure who they are. And that's a real problem when you're fighting a guerrilla war. So when they say that Saddam supported terrorism, the official and the State Department's Patterns on Global Terrorism report, they list 33 groups. First of all, we shouldn't even have a war on terrorism. We need a war on Al-Qaeda, because terrorism is a very general term, and it's often used to inflame people both at home and abroad and get them revved up to do things. The State Department mentions the groups that Saddam supported. Most of them were directed toward Iran, who was his archenemy, and also he supported Palestinian groups. He really didn't support groups that focused their attacks on the United States. So I think we really need to nail down any connection with the 9/11 attacks before we invaded. Now, of course, we have invaded, and we now have a mess on our hands, and we have to ask ourselves, what we did was we said, well, if there's any doubt, let's go to war. Well, if we apply that rule, we've got a lot of fighting to do. We've got both Syria and Iran were bigger state sponsors of terrorism than Iraq. And so why didn't we go after them first? Do they have links with 9/11? I think this has been used as a political football to go after Iraq. And so I think if we do go after these groups, we should do that covertly. But I say we ought to fight our own battles. We ought to go after al-Qaeda. I mean, frankly, I'm just going to this may be an unpopular view, but I think Israel needs to fight the Palestinian groups by itself. We can't fight everyone's battles for us, and frankly, we're making things worse for ourselves. And my view is, in the long term, we have to assess why these people are attacking us, why they're going all the way across the world to attack us. And that's not appeasement. As the ambassador said, you need to know your enemy. And bin Laden's very clear why he attacks us. And there's been an attempt by certain people to muddle this, but it's for our foreign policy. And it's primarily our support of, it's not our support of Israel, although that's a factor, but it's a support for despotic secular governments that he thinks are corrupt. So I think if we, in the long term, I wouldn't do a lot of these interventions in the first place, because I think, as we found out in Afghanistan during the Cold War, as we found out when we helped Saddam win the Iraq-Iran war, it destroyed the balance of power in the region and led him to invade Kuwait, which then continued with all these other problems. We gave him most of it, we and the Germans gave him most of his chemical precursors, and of course the United States gave him his biological agents as well. So I think we really need to do no harm in our foreign policy first, and that's a very low standard, but frankly we haven't even lived up to that. So I think we need a more restrained policy, and I think it will cut down on the number of terrorist attacks. And when we do need to fight terrorism, as we did after 9/11, we need to do it quietly. We don't need to build up these people like bin Laden and make them heroes. We're doing this again with Zarqawi in Iraq, and I think you know, this is doing exactly what bin Laden wants us to do. The standard technique of terrorists and guerrillas is to hit the stronger opponent, get them to overreact, and the terrorist group gets all the volunteers and all the funding it can handle. And that's exactly what Bush did, and I think bin Laden got what he wanted. And I think if Bush would have reacted much more covertly, in a much more restrained factor, and gone after the real enemy, we'd be a lot safer today. Thank you.